but I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to be here and to address what I think is the most important process going on in the world today. Probably most people don't think that, but I hope at the end of today you will think that. For me, participating in the work of ending hunger and poverty in the world is the key to a sustainable future for all humanity, and probably one of the greatest historic human endeavors on the planet today. If there's ever an area that can use your understanding, your support, your leadership now and for at least the next 20 years, from my perspective, this is it. Purpose of my talk today is for all of us to have a new relationship with our world, to gain some insight into the root causes of hunger and poverty, to get clarity on some strategies that actually are successful in sustainably ending hunger and poverty, and to have a new understanding of leadership. Now, I love the title of this symposium, being a question, can one make a difference? The answer, from my perspective, is not necessarily for the better. A great deal of what has been done in the name of ending hunger and poverty in our world has been frankly counterproductive. And bringing your leadership and your commitment and your resources and your intelligence to things that don't work, to things that are counterproductive, would be counterproductive. So we're doomed, one way or another, we are going to make a difference in this issue. And it has taken the Hunger Project 30 years to learn what we've learned so far. And I want to share some of that with you today so that hopefully as you get involved with this, we can get off on the right foot. First, I'd like to just see how many of you have visited Africa. 1, 2, 3. And South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Okay, or Latin America. Okay, that's great. Well, these are the areas that we're going to be talking about. And we're going to be talking about people who live in the rural areas. Now, usually one of the big challenges in dealing with the issue of hunger and poverty is that the media throughout all of our lives has bombarded us with images that are also frankly counterproductive. So when you think of world hunger, what would you guess would be the main image that comes to people's minds? This is participation time. What? Starving kids. Starving kids. Sally Struthers in Ethiopia. Yeah, images like this of severely malnourished children waiting in lines for handouts of food. Now, these images are real. They still do happen. But according to the Food and Agricultural Organization, only 8% of hunger-related deaths have anything to do with this kind of emergency, with wars, with famines, with droughts, with refugee movements. 92% of hunger-related deaths have nothing to do with emergencies at all. They are business as usual. And if there were an iconic image of the persistence of hunger and poverty on our planet, it is this. A young mother who has living in a rural area, probably a woman-headed household. She's probably 14 or 15 years old. She's likely pregnant with her second child. She's scratching out a living with tools that are not different than they were 2,000 years ago. And this is life for about 800 million of our fellow human beings. Scratching out a living day after day and never quite having enough to make it. This leads to 20,000 of us dying every day, most of whom are women and children. Now, why would people tolerate this kind of existence? Why wouldn't we see revolutions exploding in the rural areas of every country where this kind of hunger and poverty exists. Sorry?
That's what they know.
Exactly. And what do they know? What is it when they think of themselves? Who do they think of themselves to be? How do hungry people perceive the problem of hunger? Sorry? It's the norm. A dirty trick by God, their destiny. For generations, people living in hunger and poverty have been told they're worthless, they're powerless, they have no ability to change their own future. They have to wait for handouts from somebody, and those handouts never come. So this centuries and centuries and centuries of experience has taught people that they are powerless and worthless, that they're dependent on someone else and there's nothing that they can do. And that profound resignation is what has to be broken, number one, to end hunger and poverty in our world. I want to show a brief film that shows how that process works, and then we'll talk some more. Before we go on, does anyone have any questions or comments from watching the film? Yes?
So the success that they had in the village, like how long did it take for them to get all that done?
Great question. What we've seen is that it takes approximately 5 years to go from extreme poverty to what we define as self-reliance, where no outside inputs from the Hunger Project are needed anymore, and economic growth keeps happening. Usually some results happen during the first year, particularly right after those first workshops, because if people get all inspired and they have a vision for what they want to do and it doesn't happen, then that makes the resignation even worse. So that we train the volunteer animators who are from those villages to really be brilliant when they do those first workshops of having people pick projects that will succeed without any outside help. And those usually happen within 3 or 4 months, but they're usually pretty small. But to get everything up and running, about 5 years.
So all of your animators are trained from like each village?
Yep. We go, there was a picture of one of the first kind of starting workshops in the film. We call it the Vision, Commitment, and Action Workshop, because that's what it does, vision, commitment, and action. And out of that, just like any time you're leading a workshop, some people will bubble up out of that as natural leaders in the village, and then they do a 4-day animator training to really be trained in the principles of self-reliant development. And then they meet every month and keep supported and compare notes and see what's working. Yes?
Do you find a lot of resistance from, like, for example, maybe the elders in the town who are losing a bunch of power? And how do you cope with that?
Yes, was the answer. And cope, one of the interesting things that probably any woman on earth could tell you is that women develop a whole series of coping skills for dealing with men. And it's usually the men who are in power and the women who are coming into power. And so issues of inclusion, of including the traditional leaders at every step of the way, having them like each step of the way, that you can transform a society without necessarily changing all the traditions. Kind of like England, still has a monarchy, but they're a modern country. So villagers get very skilled at how to balance deep social change with honoring certain traditions that keep the society together. Yes?
So is it a primary goal of the Hunger Project to actually promote gender equality, like specifically, or is it just kind of the angle?
It is a big priority. This was not our priority when we started. We had no idea that the root cause of 85% of hunger in the world was the mistreatment of women. I mean, we were as clueless as most people still are about that. And then we read this study. This was a UNICEF study. Great segue, by the way. This study came out and they observed that the rates of childhood malnutrition in South Asia are twice as high as in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we're all used to thinking of sub-Saharan Africa as being the worst hunger, but the worst hunger is in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, Afghanistan. Why is that? And they studied 9 factors and concluded there was only one reason, and that was that the subjugation of women in South Asia was that much worse than it is in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's not great in sub-Saharan Africa. So that we had noticed that in our programs, it was mostly women who were involved. It was mostly women whose lives were improving, and that was improving the lives of the families. But we also noticed that we weren't really changing the basic male-dominated power structure in these societies. So after reading this, we completely redesigned our programs and launched initiatives that were strategically targeted at catalyzing a permanent shift in gender relations, as well as mobilizing self-reliance. I'll introduce you to a few of these people more in detail. This is Shanti Urabaru from the slums of Dhaka in Bangladesh. After taking the VCA workshop, she organized the people in her slum, which was just filthy, to set up a private sector slum cleaning project. They discovered that everybody in the slum hated it being messy and would actually pay a little to have it cleaned up. And they set up a business to clean their own slum for tiny little fees for every person who lived in the slum. Everybody participated. The business was a success. She used her projects to build a school in the slum. This is Shanti's school. This is one of their field day races. That's Reshma is the name of the little girl winning the race. If ever there was an icon for what we want to achieve in life, it's that. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a reunion of some of the 100,000 trained volunteer village animators that we've trained in Bangladesh. 15,000 of them paid their own way to come to Dhaka from all over the country to attend this reunion. The top people in government came and spoke. It was really a success. This is Odila. She has made her money by taking a bus to the city, buying flip-flops and plastic water containers and bringing them back to the villages and selling them. She was at our epicenter. She was able to take out a loan. Here's the teller at her bank, the number one teller, Lucy Chilemba. And she was able to build this house with her profits, and then she built another house, and now she's a landlord. And there are 100,000 women who've participated in this economic development program so far. This is Tarsila, who Tarsila worked her way through elementary school. She went from her village into the town, got a job as a domestic servant to put herself through elementary school. The masters of the house said, "You're an Indian. Why do you want to go to school?" I mean, the racism in a lot of Latin America is really bad, particularly in Peru. She has now organized a movement, a federation of organizations that covers all 37 indigenous language groups in rural Peru. They all come together, they decide what their priorities are, they develop a training workshop, and then they do it in Spanish all together, and then they go back out to their villages and then do it in the local tribal languages all through their areas every quarter. The Hunger Project isn't a disaster relief organization. However, sometimes disasters find the places that we've already organized, like the tsunami hit Tamil Nadu, an area where we've been working for 10 years. Just devastated the place. You all saw on the news there was tons of emergency relief coming in. It was complete chaos. The relief workers were tripping over each other. What the Hunger Project, since we'd already been working there, we got the village councils that we had organized and trained to sit down to really think through what they needed to do. For instance, in this village, a lot of the men were killed. There were a lot of widows. Their priority was to build a widows vocational training center. That's me with a dot on the forehead. We all saw in the papers what a disaster it was for the fisher people who lost their boats. Turns out that's not the lower caste people in India. The lower caste people are the farmers. And the farmland, once covered with salt water, took over a year to clean out. But that was their priority. They worked up a system, went to the university, got the experts to come join them, got the salt out of the water. And this was the first peanut crop a year after the tsunami. It was only at about 50%, but still, it was amazing they had anything. The happy tsunami-affected people. One of the things that we do in these areas is that we have these clusters of villages create a formalized plan for addressing everything that they want to address. These were the micro plans for each cluster of villages in the tsunami-affected areas. And our teams there worked to have these carry the weight of government, so that any government agency or any aid agency that wanted to do anything had to have it fit within what the people in that area had decided they wanted. There are in India, thanks to a change in the constitution that the Hunger Project India had lobbied for, a reservation for women in village government. So in a country with the worst subjugation of women after 1994, all of a sudden, 1/3 of all seats in village councils were reserved for women. 1 million women came into elective office in India. That's more elected women than in all the other countries of the world put together. So, and this is far and away the greatest social revolution on our planet today. The Hunger Project has so far been able to train and support and empower 65,000 of these elected women leaders. We'd like to do all million. We're working towards that. If you were a compassionate government, a caring government, and you wanted to help your people, and you were newly free, like a lot of governments were in the 60s, the most natural thing in the world would for you to try and deliver services to the poor, to try a top-down service delivery approach to bring health care, education, farm training to the people. These top-down systems have almost never worked. They're tremendously inefficient. They attract corruption like jam attracts flies. But most importantly, they fail to recognize the most important resource. And in fact, they undermine the most important resource, and that's the people themselves. They treat people as passive beneficiaries. Now, we in the Hunger Project have made beneficiaries a curse word. We're not allowed to say it except in explaining that we're not allowed to say it. Because the truth is that when you really look at what is putting food in people's stomachs day after day, it's not top-down programs. It's the hard work of people themselves. And the people themselves don't even realize that. So creating a system that's designed from the start to recognize people as the authors of their own development and then discover how to support their success every step of the way, that's the approach we take. And what we've seen is that it lasts. There are clusters of villages that have been self-reliant, no funding going in from the Hunger Project for more than a decade. We still visit those areas once a year. They're thriving. They're continuing to make progress. It really does work, and it's not easy. The three things, as you mentioned one of them, first is to really mobilize people for self-reliance, to break through that mindset of dependency, to have people know that they can do something, and to build their confidence in their own abilities. Probably a little like the Air Force Academy does. Second are these interventions for gender equality. What we've tried to find is what is the trim tab? What is the highest leverage opportunity in each culture that's just ripe for a transformation in gender relations? In the case of India, it was the new law granting women a chance to be in village councils. In Africa, it was having women own the banks, creating microcredit banks that the women locally themselves owned and operated. And the third is local democracy. Imagine for a moment that in your town that you grew up in, that there was no local school board, that the local teacher in your first or second grade class was accountable only to somebody in Washington, D.C. You would have a situation not unlike India, where teachers don't even bother to show up, health workers don't even bother to show up except for the 30th of the month when they get their paychecks. Until there's local accountability, strong accountability at the local level, things don't work. And so after my first visit to, think of anything that sustains basic life: water systems, sewage systems, health systems, education systems, farming systems. Those are all local. Central governments have very little to contribute to those things, and local people have everything to gain from having them work. So moving power out of the central government down to the local districts, villages, sub-districts, that makes a night or day difference. Now, I promised to talk a little about leadership. We in the United States have grown up with the highest admiration for a particular form of leadership that was dubbed transformational leadership by the scholar James McGregor Burns back in 1978. It's characteristic by Dr. King, by President Kennedy, Lee Iacocca, Nelson Mandela, these larger-than-life, highly committed figures that really call people to a higher standard. They use their charisma, they use their emotional appeal to call forth people's greatness. They create an inspiring vision, and they challenge people to step forward. This kind of leadership is a form of top-down leadership, and it's brilliantly successful in certain situations. It's brilliantly successful in getting a law changed or winning freedom for a country. It's absolutely critical in anything having to do with production and logistics. You need somebody to call the shots, and you need everybody to be on the team to make it happen. However, in breaking through poverty and hunger, we have found this form of leadership is not the answer. It's very dependent on that charismatic leader. When that charismatic leader isn't there, it's not happening. And in recent years, a whole new school of thought has come about that's not transformational leadership, but transformative leadership. And it has evolved from the women's movement, from Paulo Freire and the literacy movement in Latin America. A lot of people have begun to see this difference. It is an approach to leadership that really avoids any forms of patriarchal, top-down style of leadership. It means instead of leading out in front, you lead with people. You lead with the group. You see a group of people practicing this style of leadership, you may not even know who's in charge. The key characteristic of this kind of leader is humility and a commitment to mutual learning, to learning as much as one has to offer in terms of teaching. If you've read the book Good to Great by Jim Collins, it's level 5 leadership that has been shown in big American corporations to be really successful. It's based on a dynamic that's called praxis, and that's another way of saying learning as you go. It's been a guiding principle in the Hunger Project from the beginning. We have no clue how to get to the top of the mountain. We're climbing this huge mountain, the end of hunger, in the fog. We can see to the next 500 feet ahead. Okay, we'll get to that plateau, and we'll hope to see the next 500 feet ahead. So it has that approach of taking action and then reflecting and learning together from that action and then taking the next action. And it is really committed to inclusion. In a lot of competitive or patriarchal or hierarchical system, there's a real competition to get to the top. There's a process of exclusion that's important in many sectors of society. When you're dealing with poverty, it's the very people who are the least likely to step forward, who are the least articulate, the least capable, that you most want to encourage to participate. So this kind of leadership is fanatic on the subject of inclusion. Another object lesson that we've learned that I wanted to share is that it doesn't take a village, as it turns out. Villages in the third world are too small. They're almost by design too small to have any political power. They're 100 families, 150 families. No way they're going to get the attention of government. But if you can get a cluster of villages working together, about 5,000 people or 10,000 people, then you can get action from your own government. And that's what we focus on. This is one of the clusters in Bangladesh. They've declared themselves 100% literate. That's literate in Bengali, not English. And 100% safe sanitation in a country where the average is only about 10% safe sanitation. So they have big campaigns. They get charged up. You can have a lot of people. It really works to work at the cluster level. You were asking how long it takes. In India, we have a strategy for empowering the women who are elected into local office. They serve 5-year terms, and we've discovered kind of by trial and error what to do each of those 5 years to build the confidence of the women, to have the men and women working together successfully. We start out in year 1 after women are elected with a women's leadership workshop, follow-up workshops to mobilize people to start participating with their village council, having public meetings, getting it reported on in the media, starting to create some buzz. That happens the first year. The second year is really devoted to creating those micro plans. They've had a few successes. They've got a little bit of confidence. Now they really look, okay, here's what we've got in the village. Here's what's missing. How many classrooms do we need to build? What do we need to do about putting in wells, etc. Then the third year, once they've started that plan, then they will undoubtedly and predictably run into a bunch of corrupt officials at higher levels. So we foster the creation of federations. We get the leaders from all the villages in a county to form a federation and not put up with it anymore. And these federations can really get things done. Year 4 is really about getting that partnership with government to work, getting laws changed, policies changed. Then year 5, it says sweep. That is to build on those successes to get a lot more women participating in the political process, to knowing that they're allowed to vote. That is often kept a secret from women in India, or that they can decide who they want to vote for themselves, encouraging women to run for re-election. They had a reserve seat the first time. That was relatively easy. Next time they'd have to, if they want a re-election, they have to stand for election against men. That's harder. We've had a lot of success with that. We've got states now in India that are approaching 50%, 50-50 representation in their village councils. Another thing that we've learned is that it really works to make a little bit of progress on everything and not just try to work on one thing. Like there are a lot of NGOs that go in and will help a village with water, but they won't do anything about income. Or they'll work on microcredit, but they won't do anything about health. And life just isn't like that for people. You know, if your child is sick, what you want now is health. So we find that there's a real synergy in working on all of these goals at the same time. They've now been, this approach has now been officially adopted as the Millennium Development Goals, and it really, really works. Yes?
I'm curious about, we have the girls back in school, we have the women working and have some gender equality, and the men either coming back or contributing. Are you seeing a generational change in the young boys in terms of what they see versus what they might hear from the elders? So are they growing up under this structure and perpetuating it, I guess is the question.
Yes, is the end. I mean, and not just with the boys. As the economy starts to thrive in the rural areas, the husbands come back. they, we've seen as women become elected officials, we've seen husbands start to pick up some of the household chores. There are men's groups that do workshops on the subject in the villages, particularly around the HIV/AIDS issue. Male responsibility is a huge part of it. That becomes a huge shift in gender relations overall. After those workshops, we've seen a big drop in domestic violence. So things kind of happen everywhere. And we've seen the elders also, some of the priorities that women have that men have never paid attention to are things like sanitation. In a lot of rural areas, women have to rise before dawn to relieve themselves to avoid being beaten or raped. I mean, a latrine is a luxury for a guy. It's a basic human right for women. And it's a matter of security. And so what happens in a lot of villages is the first thing the men notice is that the villages stop stinking. And they notice that and they like it. And they can easily figure out who did it. So there's respect even among the elders of the difference of having both male and female priorities being addressed. So we see it affecting everything. Yeah. But we started taking this kind of multisectoral approach in 1990, and we really saw that it worked. What was interesting was once it became an international norm with the Millennium Development Goals, the villagers really loved that. And if you go to our epicenters in Africa, you'll see the MDGs written out in the local languages, and they talk about them. I mean, this was something nobody predicted. Everybody thought the MDGs are just a top-down thing. But we've seen villagers really argue for... I was at a conference in Ethiopia, and there were these big hotshot academics and some of the villagers from our villages there in this symposium. And the big experts are saying, well, 8 goals is really too many. It's just too many. You can really only have 2 or 3 goals that you need to work on. And this woman stood up, the vice chair of the epicenter, and said, look, those are our goals. That's what we need. We're going to do them. Y'all can help us or not, but that's what we're going to work for. And it really has made sense to people. Yes?
How would you think these goals or this entire setup would work in a culture, say, where it is written into religious codes that women can't be equal to men or shan't be or shall never be?
Like my religion, for example, Christianity, it's in there a couple of places.
Well, and in some places it's practiced more fundamentally than others.
Yeah.
And not all parts of the world are necessarily starving at the same levels as these areas. However, like you tried to introduce this to rural Saudi Arabia, how would you think the reaction would be, and would you be able to overcome that, say, with a different set of goals?
It's tough. Religious fundamentalism has been used and exploited to prop up patriarchy in every religion in the world. And there are feminist Muslims, feminist fundamentalist Christians, feminist Hindu, practicing Hindus, who are trying to reach back. I mean, when I'm in Bangladesh, for example, the young Muslim women there are very clear that Islam is the religion of gender equality, and that all of the terrible misogyny that's done in the name of Islam is pre-Islamic, Arabic cultural practices that got dragged into Islam, but that the Quran itself speaks equality. So there are people working on this struggle and have been for 150 years. The women's movement in India is as old as the women's movement in the U.S., but it's a bigger uphill battle. So there's, but if you step back and kind of the large historic view of the evolution of human freedom, this is the time where it seems to be coming together, where the inbred hierarchy, women and men, is transforming, and it seems to be unstoppable. So it's tough. People are dying. There are assassinations, but prior to this, there was the silent tens of thousands of domestic deaths. I mean, I read where there are more domestic deaths in Russia due to domestic violence every year than in all the wars in the world every year. So it's a silent Holocaust that's now getting addressed.